Hello everyone. URs are some of the most sought after and anticipated shipbuilds in the game. The indication that one is on the horizon sparks debate on which faction she represents and who she is. Today, I've compiled a list of potential carriers that could be joining us in the future as a summonable UR, or if applicable, a DR research ship. I've tried to be as exhaustive as possible. This means, however, there'll be a lot of unbuilt or paper ships, especially as we get further in. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Starting with the Eagle Union, we have a couple of the Essex class. Not much of an introduction needed here. Built during the war as a successor to the Yorktown class, they would form the backbone of the US carrier fleet for years to come. While predominantly SRs, a few have extensive careers that could push them into UR territory. Lexington is in a similar position to Yorktown story-wise, being the injured older sister to an important character, and given her extensive service in World War II, in addition to remaining afterwards until 1991, is likely to get a UR Type 2. Bonhomme Richard may also have a chance. Korea was nothing particularly special, just another Essex class really, but given that the only version of her that can exist across all timelines is her meta, a non-meta Bonhomme Richard may be a UR due to a miracle required to allow her to even exist. Following on from the Essex class is the most obvious pick for this list, the Midway class. Entering service just after the war's end, they clocked in at 45,000 tons, were equipped with an extensive air wing of around 130 planes, and an armoured flight deck, making them an absolute shoo-in for Eagle Union URs. They're pretty much the culmination of aircraft carrier development up until that point, so it's no wonder that many nations would design ships that would be considered their equivalent to the Midways even if they were never built. 3 future URs are possible, in the form of Midway, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Coral Sea, but a further 3 whose construction was cancelled and would go unnamed. Believe it or not, we can go even further than the Midways with the United States class. Class of 5 carriers, designed to carry large bomber aircraft, with later design revisions adding more space for escort fighters. These things were huge, prototype supercarriers basically, designed to operate alongside conventional carriers providing air cover, and a command ship taking on the duties of the carrier's island as the pilot fish. They would also carry nuclear weapons as part of the uranium fever the US partook in at the time, but this, however, would be their downfall. The ability to carry nukes made them a target of inter-service rivalry with the newly formed US Air Force, as they were a threat to their monopoly on nuclear weapons delivery. And on the 23rd of April, 1949, the Secretary of Defense would accept the Air Force argument for large long-range bombers providing nuclear deterrence, even the carriers with no purpose and leading to eventual cancellation just 5 days after the lead ship, the United States, was laid down. It's kind of hesitant to put them on here, but they aren't too far removed from the period, and a carrier with lacking airspace control but incredible striking power could be interesting. Moving on to the Royal Navy, we have Indefatigable rounding out the Implacable sisters. Same as her sister, she's a slightly larger, faster illustrious, thinner bulkheads and hanging side armour, with a larger air wing. Indefatigable is famous for face-tanking a kamikaze to her island and returning to flight operations less than an hour later. Not really a lot to say here. The smaller air wings compared to their contemporaries was a frequent cause of concern regarding the Royal Navy's armoured carriers. The solution? Make them bigger. This leads us to another obvious pick for UR carriers, the Audacious class. Carriers were able to accommodate the larger aircraft entering service at the time, in addition to a larger air wing and also boasting increased flight deck armour. There are 2 ways Manchu could implement the Audacious class, granting us 2 to 3 carriers depending on the route they decide to take. Historically, their construction was halted for a few years until after the war, where Audacious would be renamed Eagle and Irresistible to Ark Royal. They would then be completed to different modified designs, with Eagle remaining closer to a World War II spec, while Ark Royal would be one of the first carriers built with an angled flight deck. This would give us a UR Type 2 for both Eagle and Ark Royal. Alternatively, they could stick with the World War II designs. It is a game based around World War II ships after all. Being Audacious and Irresistible as separate characters, but Eagle fans rejoice. The third carrier, scrapped at around 25% completion, was also named Eagle, allowing her to get a Type 2 regardless of how they choose to implement them. There was also a 4th ship, however she was reordered as a multi-class. Speaking of the multi-class, the British Midways that never were. Designed slightly after the Audacious class, the Multis were part of a major expansion to British naval aviation. Designed with the rapid growth of aircraft size and speed in mind, allowing it to carry many large aircraft and drawing from experience of the Americans in the Pacific, much like how the Midways were influenced by lessons learned from British armoured carriers. This culminates in Design X1, 15.24 metres, 50 feet, shorter than the initial Design X that had previously been rejected on the grounds that its immense size would have made manoeuvring difficult in some ports. They would carry up to 108 aircraft. There may have been a push towards an armoured flight deck based on British experience in the Pacific. However, redesigns of the hangar had caused a delay in construction of the first pair, and with the second two due to start soon, they may not have been timed. Not that it mattered, as their class was cancelled shortly after the war. This gives us up to 4 potential candidates for Azur Lane: Malta, Africa, Gibraltar, and New Zealand. There was also Habakkuk, but no. Up next, Sakura Empire. Starting with a potentially controversial pick, Unryu class Amagi. The Unryus were nothing particularly special at this point in the war, and Amagi's career was even worse. But it's still Amagi, and given her importance to the story as the main motivation for Akagi's actions, being dead but for real, and already being an SR, a Type 2 CV Amagi could potentially be a UR. This is assuming that Type 2 allows changing a ship's hull type, though I don't see a reason as to why it would not. Given that Shinano is already in the game, there are no more real steel Japanese carriers to make URs out of. There are, however, a number of counter designs to pull from, the first of which being the G15 project. These are a class of 5 carriers ordered as part of the modified 5th Naval Armament Supplement Program. The G15s were an upgrade version of the G13 carrier, Taiho, featuring improved underwater protection, extra AA firepower, and a slight enlargement of the hull, alongside a number of other minor changes. All 5 would eventually end up getting cancelled, however. We actually have one in game already, in the form of Hakuryu. You may have noticed that going from Taiho to her upgraded descendant skipped a plan number. This is because the G14s were entirely different ships. Not a whole lot is known about these ships, only that there are 2 of them, as part of the original pre-war 5th Naval Armaments Program. They would displace 45 to 50,000 tons, and were given the ship numbers 801 and 802. Likely would have been a further evolution of the Taiho, with greater capabilities and a size similar to Shinano or even middling. However, they were both cut from the wartime revised program and were replaced with the G15s. Additionally, there was the G18 project, the final Japanese carrier project of the time. A wartime design-like carrier meant to succeed the Unryu class in Izumo's ill-fated conversion. They would displace 15,500 ton standard and carry approximately 42 aircraft, but would go unbuilt due to the deterioration of Japanese shipbuilding during the war. Now it's the Ironblood's turn, leading with the Flugzeugträger 1 project. By 1942, the German Navy had become aware of the value of aircraft carriers, following the sinking of Bismarck and the British attack on Taranto, and set about converting existing ships into auxiliary carriers. Among these selected ships was ocean liner SS Europa, of whom the Aircraft Carrier 1 project would centre around. Europa's conversion was not good at all. It would have been a massive ship of 44,000 tons standard with a length of 291.5 metres, 956 feet. But despite this immense size, she would carry just 42 aircraft, 18 dive bombers and 24 fighters. Things only get worse from here, as the ship also had problems with structural weakness, instability, a high fuel consumption, and the inter-service rivalry between the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe over planes and pilots. By the time the design was finished in late 1942, these problems were deemed unsolvable, and Europa would sit out the rest of the war. She is a plan for a big German carrier though, so I can see Manju making her a UR through some Shinano tier shenanigans. Well. Unfortunately, that's all they really have historically, unless you want to count the 2 other Graf Zeppelin class that will be built to revised design under Plan Z, said, whatever. But they're not completely out of options. They still have a chance with a yearly World of Warships collab, specifically Manfred von Richthofen and or Max Immelmann. Both of these sister ships are fictional carrier conversions of an H-class battleship that may be available to us through future PR waves. On the topic of World of Warships, Admiral Nakhimov is the first candidate for the Northern Parliament. Another hypothetical conversion, this time of a Sovietsky Soyuz class battleship. Nakhimov is kind of strange. The catapults aren't mounted on the bow but are slightly further back and angled outwards, and the dual-purpose AA is mounted in 6 weird 130mm quad turrets. Given recent PR waves tend to focus on the newest ships, and Soviet carriers already getting represented by Chkalov in PR5, this may be unlikely, but it's still an option. For something slightly more real, we have Project 69AV and Project 71B. I decided to group these two together since they're both involved with the Kronstadt class. Project 69AV was a conversion of Kronstadt's incomplete hull, while 71B was instead a carrier based off of Kronstadt. Given that Manju tends to put carrier conversions to the same rarities that are modified sisters, a CV Kronstadt sister could very much be a UR. 71B, on the other hand, is a bit more questionable. You see, we already have one in the form of Chkalov, who is a priority, not a decisive. This may just be because she reached alongside Brest, a large cruiser, and Plymouth, Hitler and Wales, both who cannot really be anything less than DR, but it can still throw a UR Project 71B into question. Finally, for the Russians, Project Kostromysinov. This one has a bit more history to it. Soviet engineers had been given the opportunity to visit Graf Zeppelin, and that, potentially combined with the list of information they had on Allied carriers, led to this design. A 300-metre, 984-foot carrier displacing over 50,000 tons at full load, armed with 104 aircraft, 66 fighters and 40 bombers. The influence of Graf Zeppelin is fairly obvious, with the 8 twin casemate-mounted 152mm guns, in addition to the 100mm dual-purpose battery mounted in 4 triple and 6 twin mounts. But who knows, maybe those 152s will allow her to defend herself against suicide boats. This ship is also coming with a disclaimer. Soviet, now Russian, naval projects are given a number, not named after the lieutenant who studied and designed it, so take this one with a grain of salt. So now I've covered major naval powers and weaker navy's aspirations to become major naval powers with no in-between. We have now arrived at that in-between, starting with the Irish Orthodoxy. Given the situation the French found themselves in during World War II, there aren't any wartime proposals to pull from. There are, however, a number of post-war designs, most notably the PA-28. A 15,700-ton light carrier ordered in 1947 that would carry up to 49 aircraft with little in the way of armour. Originally named Clemenceau, she was cancelled in March 1949 due to inadequate funding. There was also a number of more ambitious designs from around the same time, but little is known about their circumstances or specifications, so I'm going to speed through the few viable candidates and list what little is known. PA-19, tried to incorporate World War II experience, but still heavily influenced by Joffrey. 30,000 tons, standard displacement, longer than Joffrey at 260 metres, and with 10 more aircraft, bringing the total to 50. Slower than her predecessor, and also carrying an entire light cruiser with a gun for firing on surface targets for some reason. A 26,130-ton design, potentially combining protection from the Illustrious and Essex classes. Sources give conflicting information on whether this is PA-27 or 29. PA-31, a 38,000-ton carrier that may have featured an armoured flight deck. The only sources I found on this are a French Marine forum talking about the history of the Clemenceau class, and the French Wikipedia article on PA-28, so like Kostromysinov, take these last two with a grain of salt. There may be a more real UR candidate for the French in the Clemenceau class. These two, Clemenceau and Foch, were fairly light for a carrier their size, 22,000 tons standard and 265 metres long, but were capable ships. They have one major problem though. They are very much Cold War ships built around jets. And while the previously mentioned United States class are similar in that regard, they likely would have entered service around the same time as Centaur and Albion, who were among the youngest ships in the game, being commissioned in 1953 and 1954 respectively. The lead ship of these two wouldn't be laid down until 1955 and wouldn't enter service until November 1961, with Foch being 2 years behind on both. Even if they're probably too late to really fit into AO, it's still a possible pair of Type 2 UR-worthy carriers, even if Clemenceau 1 isn't even in the game yet. Ignore the angled flight deck, Cold War radars, the lacking AA weaponry, and kick the jets overboard, I guess. I'm kinda grasping at straws here. But at least the French had straws to grasp at, and Sardinia Empire isn't so lucky. While Italy saw the use in carriers, they didn't build any on the grounds of cost, being relatively unproven and limited industrial capacity. There's nothing for me to really pull from here. All the pre-war designs were within treaty limitations. They weren't built, there's no legendary career to help push into UR territory. And the peace treaty after the war forbade them from, among other things, owning aircraft carriers. They agreed converting to motion liners during the war, but Aquila was as ambitious as they got, and she's already in game as an SR. Even as the treaty's restrictions lessened over time, being outright dropped in 1951 after they had joined NATO, they wouldn't lay down their first carrier until 1981, well outside of Azur Lane's time period. It's even worse for the Dragon Emperor. The Chinese Navy of World War II was very limited and lacked any form of aircraft carrier, let alone anything UR-worthy. Much like the Italians, they wouldn't build their first carrier until much later. And that's about it. Every ship, class, or design that I think could make its way into Azur Lane as a future UR aircraft carrier. Sound off in the comments your thoughts on this video. If there's any I missed, post them down below. That's all I've got for now, so I'll catch you later.